This is my good time. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. They're so cool. Neil Gorsuch is the newest member of the Supreme Court. There's only 8 members of the Supreme Court. This is Kennedy. He just retired, so they need to replace him. They've got 4 liberal members of the Supreme Court. Sotomayor, I can't remember, Brennan, Kagan, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They are the liberal members. These are the conservative members. Neil Gorsuch, who is the newest member. This is Roberts. The black guy is, what is his name? He's a Scalia clone. Anyway, he's, I can't remember their names. Anyway, there are 4 conservative members and 4 liberal members, and now they want to appoint, what's his name? Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh is up for the Supreme Court. He seems to be extremely conservative. So how important will this be if we get another conservative member of the Supreme Court? Will that change things? Will it change the way we look at things? Will it change the way they see criminal cases? Potentially it will. So these are all questions that we have to ask Mr. Kavanaugh. Because we already have 4 liberal members, and we have 4 conservative members of the Supreme Court. So we don't know what's going to happen next. And you never know what's going to happen next. The problem, well, this isn't a problem really, but when you're appointed to the Supreme Court, you can stay forever. You can stay until you die. That's what happened with Scalia. Kennedy, of course, retired in his 80s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 81 years old. She's had health problems, but she has said that she's going to hang in there until there's a more progressive president rather than Donald Trump. Of course, if she dies sitting on the Supreme Court, she'll be replaced anyway. So right now, if they have to make a decision, since there's only 8 members of the Supreme Court, a lot of times they're tied 4-4. What happens if they're tied 4-4? Nothing, you're right. It goes back to the decision made by the appellate courts. In 2005, the California legislature passed a law banning minors from buying or renting violent video games. Does that make sense? Keep those kids from playing violent video games. They get the idea they can shoot people because they're violent video games. They get the idea that they can hire prostitutes and sit in the back seat bouncing up and down. I don't know, that's Grand Theft Auto or something. Some kind of weird video game. I've never played the game before. But they'll hire prostitutes and they'll sit in the back, and if you focus on what's going on in the car, the 2 people are sitting like far apart and they're both bouncing up and down. Sitting straight up. I'm not sure what that means. Anyway, so should we keep kids from buying violent video games? Should we have a age limit on violent video games? What do you think? Absolutely? Sure? I'm glad you thought about it. Yeah, we think we should not let the puppies play video games. Have you ever played a video game? Never? Okay. What do you think? Should the kids play video games? Who's a gamer? Do we have any gamers? No? Nobody's a gamer? What a boring. You think I'm boring. You guys are boring. So what do you think? Video games? No video games? Let them? Don't let them? Yeah, go ahead and let them play the game. No? Shouldn't let them play the games? Cut them off? Don't let anybody below the age of 21 have any of these violent video games? What do you think? Yay or nay? No? Don't let them have the games? No? No. Okay. Well, anyway, so California decided that they were going to limit people from playing violent video games. Pimply-faced 30-year-old guys that live in their mother's basement are the ones that are supposed to be playing these games, not these little pups whose brains aren't completely developed yet. Video game companies took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the law was overturned 7-2 as unconstitutional and an infringement on free speech. Video games are free speech. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? I know. Over the weekend they had a rally, last week they had a rally in Billings, Montana. The rally in Billings, Montana, Trump had a rally, and there was a guy standing behind him, a kid, he was only 17 years old, and the kid wasn't clapping enough. And he was sometimes questioning, with his facial expressions, he was questioning what Trump was saying. They kicked him out. They pulled him and put in people that were more enthusiastic behind Donald Trump. I mean, everybody was seeing this kid making facial expressions behind Donald Trump. And they threw him out. They threw him out. They wouldn't let him go back in. So what do you think? Is that free speech? Does it have a right to... It was social... And the selective service, the people that draft people. His security are the ones that kicked him out, told him not to come back. He's only 17 years old, he's just a high school kid, just a senior in high school. Is that right? Is that free speech?
I think he expresses his views.
So he should have been allowed to stay?
I would say yes.
Okay. They removed him, told him not to come back. In 2016, when Trump was running for president, he went up to Montana a couple of times. No, he went to Iowa a couple of times. I was at Ashford at the time. And I had students that wanted to go see Trump. They wouldn't let him in because they were Hispanic and African American. They wouldn't let him in. And they were afraid that they were there to cause trouble. How do you identify somebody who potentially may cause trouble? They identified them by who was black and who was Hispanic. And they were right. But they wouldn't have caused trouble. They were just there to figure out what Trump was all about. But they didn't want anybody that might potentially not agree with Donald Trump. They wanted loud people that would cheer for everything. When he said lock her up, they wanted people to start chanting, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. And they weren't going to say it. So they didn't let them in because they were African American and they were Hispanic. Is that right? Should you be able to do that? Was this a public forum? Should they have been able to kick that kid out of the rally because he wasn't making the right facial expression? Is it public or is it private? The answer was it was private, so they could do that kind of stuff. Anyway, as horrible and confusing as that is. Okay, this is a case that went not only to the Supreme Court, but it also went up to Congress. It also went to the President of the United States, who weighed in on this issue. This is Terri Schiavo. She suffered a heart attack when she was 26 years old. This was in 1990. She was diagnosed as being in a vegetative state. So she had no brain waves, okay? Every once in a while she'd have a blip. But other than that, she was in a vegetative state. This is before she had the heart attack, of course. She was placed in a hospice care and maintained until her husband decided that enough was enough in 1998. So they kept her in a vegetative state for 8 years. And then he decided, she's not going to come back. This is it. I can't handle this anymore. This is just too depressing. So he decided he's going to pull the plug on her. But her parents didn't agree, the Schindlers. They decided that Terri should not die, and she appealed to become her caretaker. So who has a right to somebody's life? The spouse or the parents? The parents have a right? What do you think? Parents or the spouse? Who's got a right? Who gets to make life and death decisions? A spouse or the parents? Parents? Who should have the right? The parents or the spouse? The parents, yeah. They're the ones who get it. The parents? We're all agreeing with the parents. Parents or spouse? Who should be able to pull the plug? Who's the plug puller? Well, you say spouse.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
Spouse? 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 Parents. As it turns out, in the state of Florida, once you get married, you're no longer under your parents. So it's the spouse that gets to make that decision. That's the law in Florida. So in order for them to allow the parents to be the caretaker of this child, they had to change the law. Or make a special law just for Terri Schiavo. This went on for years. I mean, it's just insane. 1998, when Michael Schiavo went to court to have the feeding tube removed, the Schindler's counterfiled. The judge decided in Michael's favor, as did the appellate court, because that's what the law says. The Schindlers tied the decision in appeals for 5 years. When they again lost, they went to the governor, Jeb Bush, to block the courts. Jeb Bush was president. He was the governor of Florida at the time. George W. Bush was president of the United States. Bush responded to their appeal by appealing to the legislature to write a law that he immediately signed, blocking Michael from pulling the plug. They wrote a special law for Terri Schiavo. Michael sued the governor and the legislature, and the courts agreed, and the feeding tube was once again pulled. Okay, so this has gone all over the place, hasn't it? I know. All he wants to do is pull the plug. And it's his right because, well, he's the spouse. And everybody agrees with him except the governor of the state and the state legislature. And they've written a special law, but the appellate court wouldn't hold up that special law. They said it was unconstitutional. You can't change a law for one person. That's what they said. So guess what happens next? The U.S. Congress got involved. Jeb went to the U.S. Congress. He said, you need to keep Terri alive. And this, I mean, it was insane. People were marching in the street talking about whether Terri Schiavo should have her plug pulled or not. I know, this is insane. It went all the way up to Washington, and Congress passed the law. And George W. Bush signed the law. Now Congress, who makes the laws in the United States, they have a special law for Terri Schiavo to stay alive. And the President of the United States, who's supposed to determine whether it's constitutional or not, signed the law. So now it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. The bill demanded that the Florida courts look at the Schindler's case. The courts refused to hear the case, though a friendly judge kept delaying the decision, and the plug was finally pulled. And now she's no longer with us. She is no longer with us. That's what she looked like before she had the heart attack, when she had blonde hair. That's what she looked like after she had the heart attack and she was in a vegetative state. That's what she looked like in a vegetative state. That's what she looked like before. Anyway, finally they pulled the plug because the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, which means it goes back to the appellate decision. And the appellate decision was that the spouse had the right to do that. Is everybody happy with the decision? You guys said it was the parents' right, right? It's not. Not in the state of Florida. According to the state of Florida, it's the spouse's decision. The spouse makes life and death decisions. We've had this situation before there are select religions that will not allow people to go to a doctor.
to seek medical treatment. And we've had cases where the child was taken away from the parents in order to get the child treated for whatever disease. These things come up from time to time. So the question is, who's in charge? And the answer is it's the Supreme Court, and they're the ones that decided. The President weighed in, the Congress weighed in, and the Supreme Court decided that they were unconstitutional, that they couldn't make that decision. It wasn't their right to make that decision. And eventually, of course, Michael made the decision to pull the plug. Michael is happily married to somebody else now. Well, Terri anymore since she's no longer with us. And he has children with his new wife. So is that happy or is that not happy? Come on, let the guy have babies. Let the guy make babies. I mean, otherwise he was stuck. He couldn't divorce her. I mean, if he had divorced her while she was in a vegetative state, society would have come down on him and looked at him as a monster. And then when he wanted to pull a plug, he eventually got it done. But it took all that mess, all that horrible mess to get the plug pulled. Justices of the Supreme Court, like other federal judges, are appointed by the President, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So all of the appellate judges, all those judges are approved by the President of the United States. They are appointed by the President, and the Senate has to approve them. And one of the things that has been happening, Donald Trump hasn't done a whole lot of stuff, but one of the things he has done is appoint judges. He's appointed lots and lots and lots of judges. He's got lots of holes in his administration, but he has been appointing judges all along. So one of the things that is happening in the United States right now is that a lot of the judges out there are relatively conservative because he's a conservative president. So he's replacing all the old judges with new judges. And that's his right, of course. And one of them, of course, was Neil Gorsuch, and the other one is maybe Kavanaugh. Looks like it's going to be hard to block Kavanaugh. Do you guys just appoint, and I made a mistake, I apologize, I made a mistake. John McCain died a couple weeks ago. They appointed a new senator from Arizona, but they won't hold a special election until 2020. They won't elect a new senator until 2020, until John McCain would have been up for election. So it's 2020 that McCain will be replaced. And actually he's been replaced by somebody appointed by the governor who's relatively conservative, and he appointed a guy by the name of Kyle. His last name was Kyle, not his first name. I can't remember his first name. But anyway, he's relatively conservative as well. He had already served as the senator from Arizona. So now when when they vote on Kavanaugh, there's one vote right there that will be for Kavanaugh. And one of the things that the governor asked Kyle before he sent him up to Washington was, how do you feel about Kavanaugh? And he said, well, I'm in favor of Kavanaugh being on the Supreme Court. So that was one of the decisions that was made. So now it's going to take one more vote for Brett Kavanaugh not to make it. One more vote as far as the liberals are concerned. Most state court judges face elections. Typically the governor makes an initial appointment, and the judge is then retained or not in a popular election. And every time you vote, those of you who have voted more than once, a lot of times you'll see, should this judge be retained? It'll say right on the ballot, should they be retained? And you either say yes or no. It's not like he's replaced by somebody else. It just asks you if you think he should be retained. And you say either yes or no. And most people just say yes. They haven't even heard of the judge. They haven't had any interaction with the judge. So they just retain him anyway. If retained, the judge serves a number of years, after which he or she again runs for retention. So it's not like they're running against anybody. It's not like the Democrat is running against the Republican. You're either retaining this person or you're not retaining this person. I've lived in a lot of different states, and I've had to vote in California, Montana, Iowa, Texas, like 3 times. I voted in Indiana. Where else have I voted? Where else have I been? Ohio? I voted in Ohio. So I voted in a lot of different states. Most of them are about the same. About the same. Supporters say that this makes judges accountable to the public. A judge who makes an unpopular decision can be removed, of course, or not retained. In this case, it's not retained, and that's how we control judges. Judicial retention elections may invite pressure from special interest groups. There is also concern that judicial elections pose a threat to the fairness and impartiality of the courts. Judges have been found to become more punitive as elections near, so that they look a little tougher for people that think that crime should be more controlled. So who should control the judges? Should they be impartial? Should it be political? Should they be apolitical? Should the Republicans run a candidate for a judge and the Democrats run somebody else? Is that the way it should be? Should it be political? This is a judge. So if you go up before the judge and you're a Democrat and he's a Republican, he's going to throw the book at you. Maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. Politics rarely come up in a criminal case. There are at least 2 schools of thought about whether judges' rulings are influenced solely by the facts of the case and the applicable laws, or whether extra legal factors play a role. And these 2 schools are legal formalism is one, and the other one is legal realism. Legal formalism: judges apply legal rulings in a careful, rational, mechanical manner with little influence from political or social influence. Is this the way it should be? Legal formalism? Or should it be legal realism? He said, stepping on his shoestring. Almost tripped myself. Legal realism: judges' decisions are influenced by psychological, social, and political factors. And that's legal realism. I know, this is a tough one, isn't it? So should politics play a role in decisions the judges make? Should social factors play a role? Should psychological factors play a role, or should it just be automatic? The reality is that if you live on the reservation, and I assume all of you live on the reservation, if you live on the reservation and a law is broken on the reservation, then you don't go to state court. You probably don't go to tribal court. You go to federal court. And if you go to federal court, what do these guys know about American Indians? Do they have a clue? These are federal judges. And federal judges hear cases, hear all kinds of cases. And the last thing they think about, probably, is race. Isn't a factor. I know. So they don't understand your motivation. Your motivation may be different. Your motivation may have something to do with family. And this guy never even thinks that far. He may have no clue who his cousins are. And you guys think of your cousins as your brothers and sisters, right? I know. Wow. Okay. So should we use legal realism, or should we use legal formalism? If you go to federal court, it's legal formalism. Okay. If it's local court, it's probably legal realism. Of course, legal realism can get you in trouble as well. Once upon a time in the South, if you were black and you went into court, all the jurors were white, all the judges were white, and you were guilty just walking into the room because you were not white. So that's also legal realism. They were taking in social factors and potentially political factors, because if they let you go, then they wouldn't be retained the next time because they had heard a case and they had tried it incorrectly. So you can go anywhere you want. There's your chairs over
Oh,
here.
yeah, my chair.
Evidence suggests that trial judges do reflect on their own experiences, assumptions, and biases when reaching decisions from the bench, especially when the decision involves some leeway, such as sentencing range. So most judges are thinking about their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own history.
So potentially, if we were using political realism and it was here on the reservation, potentially you would have individuals that would understand family structures on the reservation and how they are different from other structures. But federal judges, of course, they don't know you guys from Adam, I'm sorry, and they think all Indians are the same. And maybe they've been up north, or maybe they've been someplace else. Stephanie took your seat. I know.
I raced him up here, stopped him. It was like, oh, yeah.
This is a tragedy. Oh, yeah, I'm not going to join your, there we go. Okay, I'm not going to join your cloud. Sorry.
Until recently, federal judges were almost exclusively male. Racial minorities and avowed homosexuals were also underrepresented on the bench. Despite that, the federal court decided that they would allow gay marriage. And it was a federal decision. It was actually a decision made by the United States military. The United States military decided that they were going to recognize gay marriage. And because of that, all the states had to do the same thing. Because if you've got a military base in your state, and a lot of states do, and you wouldn't allow gay marriage, which is now a military law, if you wouldn't allow gay marriage, they would have to remove that military installation from your state. And most states didn't want that because they make tons and tons of bucks, including the state of Arizona. You guys have lots of military bases here. There used to be 3 in Phoenix alone. Williams and Luke, and there was another base in Phoenix. Williams is outside. I know, it's got the only nice golf course in Phoenix. It was on Williams Air Force Base. And then Luke. I've never actually been to Luke, but I've been to Williams. I was at Williams back in the 70s.
I went there for a softball tournament.
Oh, how weird. Okay. Although there is a small bit of evidence that judges show in-group bias, the tendency to favor one's own group, their decisions generally cannot be predicted from their gender or race alone. And of course, there are a lot of female judges now. There used to be no female judges. They were all male. It was like a big boys' club, men's club, dudes' club. I don't know what it was. Okay. Anyway, there's a lot of female judges. Decision by federal judges appointed by Democratic presidents differ from those judges appointed by Republican presidents. This suggests that judges' attitudes and predispositions do influence their decisions. Correspondingly, most social scientists favor the legal realism perspective. So if we look at who nominated all of the members of the Supreme Court, Scalia was nominated by Reagan, as was Kennedy, the one that just retired. Was actually appointed by Ronald Reagan. George H.W. Bush only nominated Clarence Thomas, the black guy. And he never made a decision that wasn't exactly the same as Scalia's. As a matter of fact, he had never spoken in a trial before. He was on the court for 26 years and had never said a word. And finally, after Scalia died, it's about 6 months later, they were hearing a case and he said something and everybody gasped. Because he had never spoken before at a Supreme Court trial. Kind of interesting. George W. Bush appointed 2 people, 2 relatively conservative judges. Bill Clinton nominated 2. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer, and Barack Obama nominated 2 as well.
Kagan and Sotomayor. As interesting as that is. Now here's the strange thing. Most people in the United States are what religion? Most people in the United States. What's a dominant religion in the United States? Oh, please.
Christianity.
Catholicism? Christianity? Well, I guess. Oh. I'm sorry. So what denomination is it? Is it Catholicism?
Catholic, Protestant.
Is it Protestant or Catholic? It's got to be one of the two. I don't think it's Muslimism. I don't think it's Judaism. Okay, so what is it?
Catholicism.
Catholicism represents about 34% of the population.
Christianity.
So most people in the United States are Protestants. And for the longest time, we hadn't had a member of the Supreme Court that was Catholic. At the turn of the 20th century, they started protesting against immigrants coming into the United States. By the 1920s, immigration had almost completely stopped. And the reason they were complaining was because they were starting to tilt the religious structure of the United States. They were getting a lot of individuals coming in from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And people in Southern Europe, mostly Italians and Greeks, those individuals are Orthodox, either Orthodox Christian or they were Catholic. People from Eastern Europe, almost all Catholic. So they were getting all these individuals that were Catholic, and they didn't like it. Because for the longest time, the United States was almost exclusively Protestant. That's the way it works. They were coming in from, they didn't like the Irish because they were Catholic, but they didn't mind the Germans because they were mostly Protestant. They didn't mind the English because they were mostly Protestant. They didn't mind the Swedes, the Scandinavians, because they were mostly Protestant. Lutheran, mostly Lutherans. But it's kind of interesting looking at the Supreme Court now. Because for the longest time, the first Catholic on the Supreme Court was like in 1936. That was the first Catholic. And everybody was Protestant. Everybody was Protestant on the Supreme Court. The first Jewish Supreme Court justice was in the 1950s. So if we look at the religious structure of the individuals on the Supreme Court, guess what religion they are now? This is kind of weird. Everything is flip-flopped. Everything is flip-flopped. Let me go back to the picture of...
Is Lutheran and Protestant?
Yeah, Lutheran's Protestant. It's not very Protestant. Actually, they follow a lot of the same ideas as... Where in the world? Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. That's weird.
How about Calvinism?
Calvinism is a Protestant religion. Where are they? Come on. There they are. Okay. All right. So guess what religion everybody is? There's only two religions represented. No, there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. No Protestants.
Catholic.
They're almost all Catholic. At the turn of the century, we didn't have a Catholic justice until the 1930s. We stopped immigration to stop the Catholics from coming in the United States. People today are complaining that we have too many people coming across the border because they're from South and Central America, who are all Catholic. So they're complaining about the religion. It's skewing things, or that's the way they feel anyway. I know, this is bizarre. This just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Who cares what religion somebody is? Well, I do because... So the people who are Protestant think that all of a sudden we're losing our power. I know my shoes untied. I stepped on my shoes. So I'm trying to walk like this so I don't trip myself. Anyway, so all of these people are either Catholic or Jewish. As strange as that may seem. They're either...
That means your girlfriend's cheating on you. Schnabel culture. And your shoes untied, your girlfriend.
I don't have a girlfriend, so I'm okay. it means that your significant other is cheating on you, right? So it's my wife is cheating on me.
Better tell her.
Now you got them all nervous to be.
I knew that. I knew that my wife was cheating on. Okay, so let's see, where are we? So we got all these members of the Supreme Court. Everything has flip-flopped. Almost everybody's Catholic now. John Roberts is Catholic. As odd as it seems, Thomas is Catholic. Even though he's black, most black people are Protestant of one denomination or another. Very rarely Catholic. But he went to Catholic school. He's Catholic, as strange as that may seem. Sotomayor is Hispanic. She's Catholic. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, is Jewish. Kagan is Jewish. All the rest of them are Catholic. John Roberts, a bit of a surprise, is Catholic. All those guys are Catholic. Strange, isn't it? Cognitive psychologists have proposed two process models of human judgment, which are useful for understanding how judges make decisions. Models of human judgment distinguish between intuitive processes and deliberative processes. Intuitive processes occur almost spontaneously, often without any thought or effort whatsoever. They just automatically happen. Intuitive processes. So if somebody was a racist, it would be intuitive. Usually it's intuitive. They don't have to think about it. It's just there. They're racist. Deliberative processes involve a great deal of mental effort, concentration, motivation, and the application of rules. Now hopefully, if a judge is making a decision, it should be deliberative. They should think about it. It shouldn't be a gut feeling. That's intuitive, if it's a gut feeling. I'm going to release this guy because I feel like he's a good guy. That's just not what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to deliberate. He's supposed to think about precedent. He's supposed to think about what has happened and whether it could potentially happen in the future. We don't want recidivism. We don't want this guy going back to jail. We don't want, if we release this guy from prison, if we don't throw the book at him, potentially we don't want him to hurt anybody else. If we've got a murderer, if we've got somebody that's potentially violent, we certainly don't want them to be violent again. So that's one of the things that's, of course, I told you the story of when I was acting as a consultant with the sex crimes in Ohio, as odd as that was. So we had to make a decision as to whether this guy was going to commit a crime again. This is a pedophile. He has done these, he's a rapist. We have to decide whether he's going to do it again. What has changed in his life? One of the things that changes as far as males are concerned is they get older. As they get older, their testosterone decreases, and because their testosterone decreases, their libido becomes less obvious. So they lose the capability of putting violence and sex together. Although judges try to make decisions by relying on facts, evidence, and legal rules rather than on personal biases or emotions, because they are ordinary people, judges tend to have intuitive reactions. And that's actually what happened in the Paul Manafort case. The judge for Paul Manafort was a 73-year-old judge from Virginia, and he wasn't he wasn't technologically astute. He didn't even use email, so he didn't Twitter, he didn't use Facebook, he didn't use any of that crap. Anyway, so and this individual didn't understand a lot of things that were going on in court, because he didn't understand that if somebody took out a telephone, they weren't going to make a telephone call. They might be twittering or tweeting or something. So he didn't really understand all of this stuff. So he banned cell phones from his courtroom for a couple different reasons. One, he didn't want people taking pictures. It's a federal court, so you can't take pictures. And the other thing was that he didn't want them tweeting. Yeah, he didn't want them tweeting. So it was really kind of an interesting case. But he got in trouble in a couple different situations. He wanted to make sure that his decision stuck. that they didn't go to appeals. And he knew that the prosecution was going to win because their case was extremely strong. So he tended to pick on the prosecution. It looked like he was picking on the prosecution. And because of that, it kind of changed what happened in the end. In the end, there was a lady that took his, one of the jurors took his attack of the prosecution as him condemning the prosecution. So she wouldn't agree to all 18 counts against Paul Manafort. She only agreed to 8 of them. And she felt like she was doing what the judge wanted her to do. As interesting as that is. Quick judgments can be overridden by complex deliberative thoughts, but judges must expend the effort to do so. They need to make decisions. A lot of times they need to make snap decisions during the case. If you've ever watched a case on a trial on television, a lot of times one of the lawyers will appeal, and the judge will either have to overrule what the lawyer has said, or they have to sustain what the lawyer has said. And that's a snap decision. And they have to use precedent in order to do that. Can this person talk about this? Should this person talk about this? Do we need to move on with this line of questioning? These are all decisions that the judge has to make, and they have to do it immediately. A lot of times in a case, the lawyers will just complain about what's going on just to slow things down, just to show that they're in charge, as interesting as that is. And sometimes they don't really have a precedent. They're not trying to back a precedent. What they're trying to do is slow the case down. And of course, it's the judge's duty to keep the trial moving and not allow one of the lawyers to control things with their objections. Does all this make sense? Because the lawyer can control things. I mean, we have lawyers out there that are bullies, and that's the way they control trials, by complaining about everything. They delay the trial by making all of these suggestions, and then they'll make them at the last minute, so the judge will have to make a decision. And sometimes that takes an extended length of time. The judge is supposed to deliberate, and of course, sometimes it just slows things down. It really all depends on the judge as to whether they allow this to happen or not. Judges have been shown to use intuitive decision processes to respond to suggested damage awards, descriptions of litigants' conduct, and inadmissible evidence. I don't know what time it is. 11:16. This class ends at 11:50. Oh, I got lots of time. Okay. Thank you. I can't remember things. Lawyers who work in law firms attend to the needs of the firm's clients. Some of them are specialists, such as they may be a lawyer dealing with labor laws, and others are more generalists, so they can practice any type of law. When you go to law school, usually you learn a little bit of everything. You become a generalist, and then when you go out and start practicing, of course, you specialize in a certain area. You read all the law in that area, so you become a specialist rather than a generalist. Some lawyers work for corporations and have only one client. They're corporate employers. And this was the case with Michael Cohen. I don't know if you've been staying up with what's going on with Donald Trump and all of his lawyers. Michael Cohen was his lawyer. He called himself Donald Trump's fixer. He had one client. Actually, he had 2 clients. As it turns out, he had 2 clients. One of his clients was Donald Trump, and the other client was Hannity. Michael Hannity? Is his name Michael? What's his first name? I never watched him. He's kind of interesting. Hannity's a conservative talk show host. He's not a talk show. He has his own show on Fox News at night. Hannity. I don't know. What's Hannity's first name? Has anybody ever watched Hannity?
What about the late night one?
Yeah, it's on like at 9 or 10 o'clock, something like that. Anyway, so Michael Cohen was a specialist, and he specialized in law for Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump had a problem, he would call up Michael Cohen, and Michael Cohen would tell him what he could do, or should do. I've already told you that Donald Trump's modus operandi was to delay things until somebody else had spent so much money that they couldn't sustain their case against him. And then they would settle. And when they settled, of course, he didn't lose. So that was his technique. That was the way he handled things. As interesting as that is. Anyway, okay. So those are our lawyers. They work for the client, whoever that client may happen to be. Many lawyers work for the government on the federal, state, or local level and have only one client, and that's the governmental unit for which they work. They only work for the feds. They only work for the Justice Department. They only work for the Department of Agriculture. They just work for that one group. Prosecutors are government lawyers responsible for prosecuting individuals charged with a crime, with a federal crime, and those are the federal prosecutors. Federal prosecutors, called U.S. attorneys, are appointed by the president, and they prosecute people for violating federal laws. So that's one of the jobs that the president does, is he appoints not only the judges, but he also appoints the prosecutors. And potentially, if he's conservative, if the president is conservative, he will only appoint conservative prosecutors and conservative judges. Now, one of the complaints that Donald Trump has is that his Justice Department doesn't seem to be very conservative, because they won't leave him alone. They keep bringing up new cases. The whole Russian collusion thing. He wants that to go away. And when he appointed the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, he thought that would go away. But so why can't Jeff Sessions make this thing go away? Why can't he do that? What's going on here? Why is Donald Trump so worried about what's going to happen with this collusion case? And why won't the Justice Department just make it go away? Donald Trump is in charge of the Justice Department because he's the president. He appointed the Attorney General. So why did Jeff Sessions recuse himself? Why did he do that? Does anybody understand what's going on? I do. Jeff Sessions was part of the campaign to elect Donald Trump. And because of that, he has a conflict of interest as far as collusion is concerned, because he has information about collusion. He was there on the campaign. So he had to recuse himself because he has a conflict of interest. Does all that make sense? Okay. So when Donald Trump complains that he recused himself, he didn't have a choice. The rules of law said that he had to recuse himself because he had something to do with it, a conflict of interest. And anytime there's a conflict of interest, you have to recuse yourself. That's just the way it works. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we understand what's going on. Or not. I don't know why you would understand. Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand. He keeps attacking Jeff Sessions and saying that he should remove him because he recused himself. He should never have recused himself. The head prosecutors for cities and counties, called state's attorneys, are elected often in partisan elections. They prosecute individuals who have allegedly broken city, county, or state laws. They prosecute these individuals. Can they ignore a case against a friend of theirs or a political ally? Can they ignore these cases? They can, but they're not supposed to. And that's what's going on. That's one of the reasons why the collusion case has been going on for 2 years. Donald Trump could have made that whole thing go away, or seemingly he could have, but the reality is he couldn't. And the reason he couldn't make that go away is because they have to hear all the cases. And this was an obvious case of collusion. They had all this evidence that there was Russian collusion in the election. We know there was Russian collusion because all of the security services, all 13 of them, said that there was Russian collusion in the last election. The Russians were involved. Okay, so we know it's there. So now we have to prosecute the case. We don't have a choice. Really? That's what's happening right now. So we'll see what happens. Well, there's Donald Trump right there. Why does he wear ties that are so long? I mean, they go like down to his knees. What's going on with his ties? Who wears ties like that besides him? Because many people accused of crime cannot afford to hire a lawyer, most defendants are represented by public defenders who are also government employees. They work for the government. Really? So that's going to be your lawyer, as somebody that works for the other side? Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. If you don't have enough money to hire your own lawyer, you're going to have a public defender, and the public defender exactly works for the federal government. This is what my sister did. My sister graduated from law school back in 70-something, 73, 74, and she immediately became a public defender. She worked legal services, what they called it back then. They tried to do away with it over and over and over again, but she worked for legal services. So she made like minimum wage for lawyers. It was really kind of strange. This is the case that where they first started putting together public defenders, and it was in 1963. The history of public defenders dates from Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, in which the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Clarence Gideon had the right to be represented by an attorney, even if he could not afford one. And now that's exactly what people will tell you. If you cannot, that's what the police will tell you. If you cannot afford one, then we will appoint one. We will give you a lawyer. So you will be represented. Nearly 2 years after he was sentenced, Gideon was given a new trial. With the help of a free court-appointed attorney, he was acquitted. And like I said, that's what my sister did. That's what she wanted to do. That's why she went to law school. She wanted to defend people that couldn't afford a lawyer. She wanted to defend poor people. And so that's what she did for, I don't know, about 10 years. And then she started working for the state, writing laws for the state, which was kind of exciting because she's the one that wrote the anti-stalking law. She wrote this is in Indiana. She wrote the spousal abuse law, which started out as the wife abuse law. But I was being abused, and I told my sister, well, you know, women, just because you're sugar and spice, you're not everything nice. And so she made it the spousal abuse law rather than the wife abuse law, which is the way it started. She wrote the child abuse laws in Indiana. And of course, now those are part of the statutes. And from time to time, people complain about the laws that she wrote. And the reason is because they've got a cousin that beat up his wife, and now the guy's in jail for 1 to 3 years, or 1 to 5, and they don't think it's fair that he had to go to jail just because he wailed away on his wife. American lawyers of the 18th and 19th centuries typically learned to practice law through the apprentice method. As education became more and more obvious in the United States, we opened law schools. The American Bar Association didn't like the fact that some of the lawyers that were practicing, especially in the South, didn't have the background, could barely read. These individuals were lawyers and they could barely read, so they decided that everybody had to go to law school. And eventually, of course, that's what happened. Initially, all you needed to do was go to law school. You didn't have to pass. You didn't have to graduate. But then, of course, now, you have to go to law school and you have to graduate. Law school is a post-BA degree, it's a post-undergraduate degree. So if you go to law school, you get your bachelor's degree, and then you can go directly to law school. Law school lasts from 5 to 6 years, depending on the state. Some places it's 4 years, but it's a graduate degree. It is not a doctorate. As it turns out, it's not a doctorate. So despite the fact that my sister went to school for 6 years, she didn't have a doctorate. She had a degree of jurisprudence. I know.
So it's not like a master's?
It is a master's. It's exactly what it is. It's like a master's. So if you get a PhD or you get an EDD, of course, you've got a doctorate. PhD is a 4-year degree, an EDD is a 3-year degree. But if you go to law school for 6 years, should be a master's degree plus a PhD. It's not a doctorate. You don't have a doctorate. So if we had a lawyer here, despite the fact they had as much education as I do, well, nobody has as much education as I do, but I have 2 master's degree and a PhD. But if we had a lawyer here, then you wouldn't call him doctor. That wouldn't be part of his name. He would put a JDD behind his name. I put PhD behind my name, which tells people I have a doctorate. But lawyers, they just have a JD or JDD or whatever. Doctorate of, theoretically it's doctorate of jurisprudence, but they're not called doctors. That's all it seems. Having worked in medicine, I don't want to call anybody that's not a medical doctor a doctor anyway. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Anyway, so there was a argument all around the United States. The South, just like almost in every other case, were way behind everybody else in opening law schools. Really kind of interesting the way it worked. Harvard Law opened in the 18th century, strangely enough. And they started writing laws or proposing laws in the 18th century. Sheldon Krieger in 2004-2007 have found that attending law school tends to undermine students' values, motivation, and mental health. Really? It makes them nuts? Really? Law school does that to you? And the answer is, yeah, it really does. If you guys go to graduate school, the probability is it's not going to drive you insane. Probably. There are reasons why you're going to go to graduate school. To become a counselor, to study psychology. Usually if you study psychology, it's going to make you saner rather than less sane. Because there's no conflict going on in your brain. You're studying psychology. You're trying to find out why people do things. But in law school, they try to teach you how to cheat. Wait a minute. They teach you that the law is more important than common sense. Do we ever teach you that in psychology? That common sense is, almost all psychology is common sense anyway, right? You read a new article about something, a journal article about something, it's usually something that you go, that makes sense, that's logical. But in law, it's the very opposite. You go to law school so that you can help people, so that you can work toward justice. But you have to remember, in the United States, we have an adversarial system. So it's not what's right, it's who argues best. That's the way it works. And they have to teach you that in law school. So it's going against what is going on in your brain. Your brain is telling you, I'm here for justice. But the reality is, justice doesn't always win. Sometimes the bad guy wins. And sometimes you're the one defending the bad guy, and you won the case. So should you feel good about yourself because you're the one that allowed this criminal to go free? And you learn that in the very first year of law school. That it has to do with who argues the best. As strange and stupid as that is. They suggest that psychological dysfunction is related to changes in motivation that occur over the course of one's law school career. The best lawyers are the ones that talk the best. The best lawyers are the ones that know the law. Understanding the law, there's laws for everything. It's kind of like statistics. If you do research and the first time you do the statistics, it didn't quite work out, you can find a statistical analysis, a way of analyzing that information and make it come out the way you want it to. And that's the way the law works. There are precedents out there, sure, but there are also older precedents. So you can call up the older precedent and sometimes you'll win your case because things change over time, or they don't change over time, or this is a precedent from the past. And now all of a sudden you're playing this mind game. It's like chess. Changes every time. So that's the way the law works, unfortunately. how lawyering made me crazy. Sheldon and Krieger in 2004-2007 used Deci and Ryan's 2000 self-determination theory of optimal motivation to explain the situational and personality factors that cause positive and negative motivation and eventually changes in subjective well-being. So you don't feel good about yourself because now you become part of what you hated. You have become part of what you went to law school to fight. You were fighting for justice. Justice, like Superman, fights for justice in the American way. But no, you're not Superman anymore. Now you're part of the bad guys. You're one of the bad guys. Sheldon and Krieger in 2004 found that increase in mental health symptoms in the first year of law school was correlated with a decrease in intrinsic motivation. Now it's all extrinsic. It has to do with money. And they start talking about money almost right away. How much can you make? Should you go into working for legal services? Nobody works for legal services unless you're a bad lawyer. If you're a good lawyer, you work for somebody and you make a 6-7 figure income. And that's what you want. That's why you're there, right? Isn't that why you're going to medical school? So you can become a doctor and make $1 million bucks? Isn't that why you go to medical school? You go to law school to make money?
Some people do.
Some people do. Sure. They don't care how they win the case. They just want to win the case. If they lose the case, they can't lose on purpose, because then they'll be disbarred. You have to do your best job to get your client off or to win the case. You have to do the best job, even if he's wrong. Remember, this is like a baseball game. If Detroit's playing New York, he's got a Detroit hat on. Not the Green Bay Packers, that's a football team. But if Detroit Tigers are playing against the New York Yankees, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. Is Detroit better because the Yankees are jackasses? No, of course not. Somebody will always win and somebody will always lose. And if you're a lawyer for the wrong side, then you have to fight as hard as you can to get them off. And if you lose on purpose, you get disbarred. They can sue you. I have a friend that became a lawyer in Indiana, in Indianapolis, and what he does is sue other lawyers for malpractice. So he sues people that lose on purpose because they were on the wrong side. I know. What a horrible, horrible person he is. He sues other lawyers. Or maybe he's a wonderful person because he sues other lawyers that lose on purpose. I don't know. This is a toss-up. I would hate to be him. I would hate to be a lawyer. It's terrible. My sister was able to become a lawyer and keep her ideas because she was a feminist. And this was during the whole feminist movement in the United States. So she was able to go to law school and pass law school and become a lawyer and work for legal services because she wanted to write laws to support women. And that's eventually what she did. She was able to do it. She didn't want to defend men. She always wanted to defend the woman that had been ripped off. She didn't want to defend men. And usually the male lawyers didn't want to defend women, so she had all the cases that she wanted. And so she was able to maintain herself because she was a feminist. But this was right at the beginning of the feminist movement. This is when women had no rights, hardly any rights whatsoever. So she was fighting for women's rights. She had a lot of intrinsic motivation. In the first year of law school, most people lose this intrinsic motivation. In the first year, students moved from pursuing their professional goals for reasons of interest and enjoyment, intrinsic motivation, to pursuing goals that would please and impress others, extrinsic motivation. If you've ever been around lawyers, they dress really nice. That's to not only impress the judges, but also their clients. And also the other lawyers. Lawyers are like teenage girls. They complain about what other people are wearing. Oh, did you see his suit? That's right off the rack. He doesn't have an Armani suit on. My goodness gracious. Did you see his watch? That's a Timex. You know, it's not a Rolex or whatever people are wearing these days, as bizarre as that is. Anyway, it becomes, extrinsic motivation becomes far more important. And making money becomes very, very important. A lot of very, very wealthy lawyers in the world. Almost all of your politicians are lawyers. They understand the law. Although 80% of lawyers said that they were proud to be lawyers and 81% said their work is intellectually stimulating, only about half of the respondents voiced satisfaction with their career, and only 40% would recommend that others pursue law as a career. You lose yourself in the law. Your ideas aren't important anymore. It's the law that's important. So you don't have any creative feelings. You can't be creative and be a lawyer at the same time. If you do, you have to quit, because you can't be a lawyer. That's not the way the law works. The law works, one thing follows the other. So you create precedent, you follow the right path, and everything falls in place, and then you win the case. That's the way it works. If you want to be a lawyer and be a writer at the same time, like John Grisham, you can't. It doesn't work. You can't do it. So Grisham had to quit law before he started writing. And then he wrote about the law, because he had experience in the law. But he couldn't do both of them at the same time. Non-white lawyers tend to be less satisfied than white lawyers, although they still recommend a legal career to others and tend to regard law as a promising opportunity. Lawyers are generally less satisfied than judges or law professors, and that is because judges get to make decisions. Remember, the law always follows the same steps. So you're almost like a mechanic. In order to change the carburetor, you have to do this, 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 and this. And you have to do it in the right sequence in order for it to take place. The law is exactly the same way. It's almost mechanical. So you don't have to worry about it. There's no creativity to it. That's strange. It may be intellectually stimulating because you have to read the law. But if you do the same thing over and over and over and over again, you don't ever have to think about it. You don't have to be creative. So law professors, of course, since they have to talk in front of people and they're other these are law students and whatnot. These individuals find the law, they are very satisfied with their jobs, as are judges, because they get to make decisions. We discovered this when we started looking at combat, individuals in combat. The individuals in combat, the ones that came out without PTSD were the ones that got to make decisions, the officers. The higher ranking enlisted people. They got to make decisions. Life and death decisions maybe, but they still got to make decisions. If you were a lower ranking individual, you had to do what you were told. So you're in lockstep with the next guy, or the guy right next to you, and you're making no decisions whatsoever. They say take that hill, you take that hill. That's your job. No decision on your part. As a matter of fact, the more you think about it, the less likely you're going to do what they told you to do. So pretty soon they beat that out of you. And people in combat, the ones that did not suffer from PTSD, about 2/3 of the people in Vietnam didn't suffer from PTSD. 1/3 did suffer from PTSD. The 2/3 were the people that were in charge of themselves. The ones that were able to make decisions, the officers, the higher ranking enlisted personnel. The lower ranking enlisted personnel, they all suffer from PTSD because they had to do what they were told. They said clean the latrine, you had to clean the latrine. And over there, oh God, you can't imagine what it was like. P.U., okay. Lawyers without typical lawyer traits may be most disconnected, contented by their law practice. The therapeutic use of law may promise a less adversarial future for lawyers. This is a lawyer who became a swimsuit model. She didn't like the law. It was, I don't know what it wasn't, but of course now she's a swimsuit model. She's from the Ukraine, as curious as that is. Anyway, she was a lawyer before. This is what she looked like as a lawyer. This is what she looked like as a swimsuit model, as you can see. She's much happier as a swimsuit model than she was as a lawyer. People generally do tend to be more confident than correct. This is known as overconfidence bias. If you start to do something and you're not exactly sure how it will turn out, you convince yourself that everything's going to be okay. And I tell people this all the time. Don't worry, everything will be okay. I know, I'm a liar.
You and Christine are the worst at that.
I know, we're terrible liars. For lawyers, this means that they are overly confident of their abilities, including their ability to predict and produce successful case outcomes. Remember, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. It's always that way. When I played softball, I always knew that my team was going to win, whether we won or not. It really didn't make any difference. I never stepped on the field thinking, I don't think we can win this ball game. Otherwise, I wouldn't have stepped on the field. I would have just gone home. I don't like to lose any more than anybody else does. But there's always a winner and there's always a loser. And with lawyers, it's exactly the same thing. You can't convince your client that you're not going to win this case. Oh, I'm sorry, there's no way you can win this case. That never happens. Even the lawyers for Paul Manafort, my goodness gracious, they called 0 witnesses. They had no witnesses. They had no case. The federal government had all of the evidence. They knew that he had made $60 million and there was not a tax return that showed that he paid taxes on that $60 million. It was a done deal from the very beginning. But they still had to go to court. And probably they told him, well, you know, if we can, they have witnesses, if we can discount those witnesses, possibly the jury is going to acquit you. And they were right on 10 out of 18 counts against him. They were right on 10 of them. Lawyers have to make predictions about case outcomes years in advance. These are probabilistic estimates. The correct answer is not yet known. Lawyers, like all, make more optimistic predictions about events in the distant future than in the near future. My daughter was going to court, and she was trying to gain custody of her son, which made sense because the other guy had never married her. He was the baby daddy, but he had taken her to court. And so she went to see one lawyer, and she was told that this is the best lawyer in town. He always wins his cases. And she talked to him, and the guy didn't really listen to what she had to say. She was upset with the guy. So she decided to go with anybody else other than this arrogant person. So she went to a female lawyer, and the female lawyer told her, well, this is where your case is strong. This, and this. These are all your strengths. These are your weaknesses, this and this. But we can discount those weaknesses, and we can accentuate your strengths, and you should be able to leave Florida. That's what she said. The baby daddy hired the best lawyer in town, the guy that was arrogant, the guy that Roxy didn't like. He hired the other guy. And so when they went to court and they tried the case, the lawyer was arrogant to the judge, and it pissed the judge off. Yeah, and he got wiped out. I know. So, lawyers are always optimistic, and sometimes they're arrogant, and sometimes, of course, they predict that positive things are going to happen. He promised this guy, because he took a lot more money than the other lawyer did, he promised the baby daddy that he was going to win, that he had the best case in the world. All the precedents are behind you. That's what he promised him. And Roxy's in Iowa now, not in Florida. My grandson is now living in Iowa, not in Florida. And he was wrong. And part of it had to do with the fact that he was such an arrogant person. All that makes sense? Okay. Yeah, okay. Another reason for lawyers' overconfidence is their belief that the outcome of the case is largely under their control. This is the illusion of control. Who controls the case? In this case, it was a family court, so who controls the case? Lawyer 1 or lawyer 2? Well, my daughter's lawyer or the baby daddy's lawyer? Who controls the case? Which of the individuals controls the case?
Maybe your daughter's lawyer?
Why would she control it? She's a girl.
I'm
She's a girl.
thinking more Navajo Nation,
Ah,
because
okay.
Navajo Nation laws tends to favor the mom.
So who actually has control over the case?
The richer,
I'm sorry?
it's like the higher people.
Well, actually, in this case, it wasn't. The guy, the baby daddy borrowed, I don't know, $20,000 from his mother. His mother's a millionaire. So she has millions and millions of dollars. They should have won, right? So who actually had control over the case? The lawyers have illusion of control. They think that they control the case. The reality is, it's the judge. The judge has complete control over the case. And in this case, it was a female judge. And since the guy had never shown any support for my daughter or for his son, it was kind of a done deal from the beginning. I mean, he had never supported the kid before, not legally anyway. And so he was SOL almost from the very beginning, and he was also arrogant as well. And the judge didn't like that at all. The male tried to be a bully with my daughter, and he tried to be a bully with the female lawyer, and he tried to be a bully with the judge. He tried to bully all these 4 females. What's the probability, or 3 females? What's the probability he's going to win?
I already failed at the first.
You failed, yeah, exactly. Seeking feedback from other lawyers can help lawyers make more accurate predictions about future case outcomes. Researchers found that discussing the value of a case with just one other lawyer, one other person, led to the accurate assessment. And actually, we see this a lot in lawyering firms. They will discuss cases back and forth, and that actually helps. If they're arrogant enough that they don't want to talk to anybody else about the case, they're probably going to get stuck in a certain mindset, not think of things in the way that 2 different people can. It is time to stop, so let's just stop right here. I know I'm way behind. I will start chapter 3 on Wednesday, and then I'm only a chapter behind. So.